My name is Peter Zoner, and I coordinate the sci-fi program under the direction of Shin. So tonight we have a really special occasion to meet together. Neville Mars, who is an architect and an urbanist practicing in Beijing, happens to be in Los Angeles and has graciously agreed to present some of his work, which includes a new book, The Chinese Dream, A Society Under Construction. This is by O&O Publishers in Holland. I'll say something very brief because Neville's asked me to be modest about his practice, which is, I think, quite remarkable. But in the few years that he's been in Beijing, 5 exactly, since he left OMA, he founded the Dynamic City Foundation, which evolves his profound passion for the metropolis. And I believe what you're going to see tonight is quite remarkable in the context of this school. It's a research and design institute which is focused on the rapid transformations of China's urban landscape. As many of you may know, by 2020, China intends to build 400 new cities. And the DCF has kind of developed in response a catalog of design prototypes suitable for the increasingly market-driven conditions in China. I first became acquainted with Neville's work in Shenzhen, where I was the co-curator of the Shenzhen Hong Kong Bi-City Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism. It's a mouthful. In which Neville presented, I think, a remarkable installation, a kind of globe of both cities and architecture all kind of combined into a sort of a neon robot, I guess you'd call it. But it was, for me, the summation of some time that I spent in China. It is, as you probably know, a remarkable society, and one which has undergone transformations that are sort of flash forward in ways that we can't really account for, I think, in the United States anymore. But there are lessons for us from China, and Neville's here to present them. So with that, thank you for coming.
What Peter forgot to mention is, please stop me, interrupt me, shout things, ask questions, anything like. I'll try to. When we came to the idea of doing this little talk, it was very difficult to have a concise question put to me, which obviously works much better. Instead, Peter rather demanded to talk a little bit about everything, which is difficult. I'll try to do that by running through the first few slides in order to get to our more current work. The first, hopefully, maybe 30 minutes is about the book and the research which we've done with the Dynamic City Foundation. Basically, a team of Chinese and Europeans, 1 or 2 Americans, who did multidisciplinary research about China's rapid development. This is the result, and this was the main question. In 2001, I came across an article online that stated that China wants to build 400 new cities by 2020. It was such a ridiculous statement that I immediately felt the urge to look into that and see what the forces are behind that statement that can produce such an immense ambition. The second step was, well, if we're going to investigate that, it really has to cover just about everything. If we're talking cities in China, we're actually talking about a new society. At 400 cities of about 1 million each, that's more than America, more than Europe. So what if you build roughly the size of the EU in less than 2 decades? How's the process, and how can you imagine what this environment is going to be like? Is there still an opportunity for us to move away from the current urbanization patterns and the type of society that it produces? Can we still reimagine China's future? In theory, obviously, that's perfectly possible. If there's so much to build, then there's so much to design, then there's a serious room to reimagine the city. That means we went right back to the very, very first question, is that even possible? Can we conceive the way to regain control over urbanization? If you will, is the city our greatest invention, or is it a mere byproduct of civilization? Before answering that, trying to answer my personal opinion, let's give a general background of what's happening in China at the moment. There is a massive move from the countryside to the coastal cities. However, both in the West and in China, there's a serious lingering misconception that this is really just to the big cities. In reality, there's a lot of cross-migration between cities and countryside, between cities, countryside, and other villages, etc. It's predominantly actually rollover migration. People move to a city temporarily, make money, send the revenues back, build up their villages, and then move back themselves. This is countered by an array of policies that top-down try to streamline this urbanization process and orchestrate it. In reality, all these policies are resulting in what this kind of abstract diagram suggests, completely blurred, scattered urban expansion. It means that instead of people moving to the big cities, the white dots, the real action is in the smallest settlements, equally the settlements with the least efficient urban footprint, the villages, the townships. You see a sort of a blue haze emerging between Shanghai, Beijing, and Xi'an. In addition, high-tech development zones and planning proposals are all moved outside of the main cities, which contribute to this scattered urbanization. But there's also a clear concentration where this is happening. We made a sort of a deduction, very basic deduction, of all the activities, economic, migration, growth of population, etc. And we can basically say that 96% of everything happens in this region. We've been calling it PUC, or the People's Urbanity of China. PUC really forces us to reimagine how we think and talk about density in China. It really puts China on the map along with the world's densest areas, India, Bangladesh, and my little town or country of Holland. Within PUC, there is another concentration. It's not completely flush, it's not completely level. In fact, the densest areas are also the fastest urbanizing, and unfortunately, it's not so clear in this diagram. The green part shows also the most productive agricultural areas. That means that where the food is being made and where the people are now urbanizing pretty much perfectly overlap, as you see in that chart. That means that agricultural land, so vital now for China to sustain itself, is being swallowed up very rapidly. When we try to consolidate this growth, we started mapping different densities on the area of PUC. For instance, this one is rather interesting. This is average LA density, the projected growth we can expect until 2020. A huge, beautiful circle that would take off just about the whole country. In reality, this area, the growth from what we have now to what we can expect is much more diffuse. But within that cloud, there's another cloud. If we look at political and economic pressures, they build up between Beijing, Xi'an, and Shanghai. This area, we've been calling it Jinghu, basically the train line between Shanghai and Beijing, is already the average density of a mid-sized American city. The difference, obviously, this is the size roughly of 2 times France. this amazing, almost inconceivable average density is possible and has been able to elude us, has been able to emerge below the radar because it's happening at village level. These are random sort of Google Earth screenshots that reveal the patterns between these big cities. Zoomed in very, very deep. You see the villages themselves are actually almost gluing together, forming an almost continuous urban region. At that point, we started to imagine, can we still give shape, can we still give direction to this growth? In a doomsday scenario, or rather, the most likely scenario, a business as usual scenario, this is what it would look like. The villages continue to dominate, with the result that all the green spaces, and particularly agricultural spaces, will be consumed. On the other hand, there is still time to imagine some sort of a dream scenario where we can guide growth based on the predominant forms of transportation. It became kind of a rather cool H-shaped sort of infinite sign, where on the one side there is a ridge of higher density growing along road infrastructure, on the other sort of nodes and blobs growing around high-speed train, and then in addition the airports are going to be increasingly important. What this does is free up a whole array of agriculture and green space, and gives a sort of a direction to allow the growth of this area to meet almost metropolitan qualities. So as we started looking for, in our first research project, looking for the 400 cities and how to position them, how to imagine them, what we found was actually one true megalopolis of already today over 400 million people and growing. This story is a bit of a shortcut, a bit of a collage, but we can, from that finding, deduct that in reality, there's not so much we can do in terms of decide and choose our destiny when it comes to cities. If that were the case, obviously we could just pick which density curve would be ideal for us to live in. In China, we are still building new cities. We are still creating our environments. Even existing metropolises like Beijing are in fact new. Their overall is all but complete, so we can conceive them as new cities. Obviously, none of these are possible, even though some would be rather ideal, like Shanghai. In reality, what's happening is that in China, two actors are the predominant forces behind urbanization: government and the developer. If we, in this story, slowly zoom in on the process, on the different skills from national to the individual, it reveals that at the developer level, there's a sort of what we've been calling checkmate real estate going on, where plots are simply fenced off by the government, then divided under different developers who then retreat, draw back, don't communicate to anybody. It's within this aggressive market far too dangerous to reveal any of your ideas of your projects. And only when it's done, they will reveal what's been planned. The result, obviously, is that all these different plots are competing on a level that there's no cohesion at all. You could have the soup du jour is maybe parking, and that whole area is just overloaded with parking. Infrastructure doesn't connect, etc. More importantly, it creates a sort of island or fortification of these urban districts. Zooming in even further, the actual new typologies that are being used are not so new either. If you look at the buildings from the 50s to roughly the 90s, the sort of well-known Chinese dormitory walk-ups, 5-6-story walk-ups, are today simply extruded to produce, at least on the surface, very different architecture. But their structure and the way they affect the city and shape the city, go ahead.
Before you go into this, I was just wondering, in reading, people say there are 800,000 people. Can you hear me?
No, I'm just maybe.
Oh, wow.
Go ahead, yeah.
It's in the podium, underneath, below, inside.
Where's my?
No, inside
You
the,
need water.
Oh, great, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah.
In just reading that I've done research, people say that there are probably 750 to 800 million people in China living on $2 a day. What is, of these villages that you showed with the Google, and they're clumping into these kind of urban centers that you're saying, but we're not talking about these 5-story buildings. That's not what these people are living in. What's the difference between how those urban, clumpings to say some of the slums, like in Sao Paulo or in Lagos, Nigeria, where they say, 1 billion people are living in that, like 1/5 of the world's population lives in a slum today. What's the difference between how those people in the villages in China are living and, say, Lagos, Nigeria?
It's a very important question, I think. The numbers are outdated, luckily. People are making a lot more, but then again, the cost of living has exploded. Even for foreigners, it's unbelievable. In reality, China has been able to maintain the appearance of not having any slums at all by simply pushing this sort of organic growth beyond the vision. The way they're doing this is with the hukou system, with the urban registration system. You're still in China very much divided in either a rural or urban citizen. It's a black and white division. In reality, the landscape is increasingly gray. That means that these slums are forming way inland along the villages, but the villages are very different from, for instance, Sao Paulo. The money that's made in the city produces a decent living environment in the village because they're building their own, we've been calling it brickification, they're stacking their own homes, sort of sometimes rather luxurious villas in the rural areas. The problem, and that relates to the money that's made now, the problem with this diffuse landscape of roughly 800 million people is that I would assume around 2030 the villagers are making a disposable income that's comparable to car ownership, that relates to $6,000 spendable in China would mean, as a good rule of thumb, these people are suddenly able to buy a car. And in such an environment, well, I'm talking in LA, it's not so punchy obviously, but in such an environment, that means 600 to 900 million people are suddenly dependent on a road infrastructure, but not compact, not even as compact as LA, but completely diffuse, which is a true nightmare scenario. The difference here is we're talking about urban environments. The urban citizen is able to make a fast move from the 6-story walk-ups to what we've been calling, extrusions of these walk-ups, dormitory extrusions. If you pile those together, it results in what we've been calling slick cities. I use this term because it's very difficult to be critical and have a critical approach in China when the new environment is looking so much better than what was there before. Beautiful. I have no problem with the aesthetics at all. It's for anybody to choose. The problem is that these typologies are generating a very difficult urban environment, of which the problems are at this point still very hard to assess for Chinese planners. If I quickly show these, a basic rough island or fortified environment. If you look at Beijing, what was once a completely level social landscape where everybody was equal living in the same environment is very rapidly turning in these very clear clusters. And this gamification travels all the way down to the district level, connected to the infrastructure. I'll talk about it later, maybe, and to the block level even. This is a silly little sketch of my first home in China, where people had built a sort of a virtual landscape where they were living in the parking garage. Basically, the developer had put them there, all 600 of them, and they made plastic gardens and everything. So true segregation, even on block level. The result of these slick cities, and I think that's the key part on this, looking at this scale, is inaccessibility. We're talking monosprawl, proliferation of monofunctional areas, and ultimately lockdown. Lockdown is a very common phenomena, has been for 5,000 years in China, so nobody is really addressing it. But today, China is no longer a communist society. It's in a way a true market-driven environment. That means that these segregated environments will surely very quickly produce a disparity on the social level. Very bluntly, we can understand Beijing's urbanization as moving people out to decongest the center, then demolishing the low-rise, moving big roads and big plazas in that can be clearly controlled and mass-managed. And then the city continues to expand and continues to fragment. Go ahead.
This question is actually related to what you're talking about. One of the key things that I've been also reading in my research is the increase in internal paramilitary police forces and into domestic security planning. What's the relationship of the urban planning to military and strategic concerns for social control?
It's vital. It's, you could say, urbanization is the key tool to promote stability on the social level. Sustainability, unfortunately, not yet. It's about keeping the dream alive. You offer people the illusion of progress, and for a small group of people there is, of course, some progress. The thing is, this illusion is being kept alive for many people who are actually not partaking in the move to the city, but are thrown back through the registration system and economically to the countryside. So urbanization is 100% primarily a political tool. The interesting thing, and that's where the hope comes from, but I'm almost cutting to the conclusion of the story, the interesting thing is that it's becoming something much larger than they could have anticipated. The dream is becoming real for many people, and at that point we have to start, the Chinese government has to start listening to the consumer and acknowledging homeowner demands, etc. So suddenly the individual has become a real stakeholder. But let me speed up a bit. On the citywide scale, we need to start pulling things together. Our number one goal throughout the scales, from national to the village, is densification. It's a crude tool, but within the, let's say, policy sprawl of China, we feel we have to be that blind to have any effect. But also on a theoretical level, it makes sense. If you look at the fast evolution of Chinese cities, you really get a clear understanding that density itself is dynamic in China. It has a location, but then again, it's constantly shifting, and it creates its own environment where you create density, new density emerges, pulls it in. It's almost like an urban gravity. So using that force, this is a little sketch of aiming for density throughout the scales. Using that urban force, we can start to imagine how we can regain control even over such an urban monster as Beijing. A little background about Beijing. It was extremely tight-knit, fine urban fabric of foot-on little alleys that out of nowhere felt the intrusion of mega arteries, highways and flyovers. with the result of an entirely new reality taking place. Nothing is pedestrian anymore, etc. But suddenly these two live side by side. If you look at this map, which only shows residential areas, you see the hutongs in gray moving outwards. For instance, in these areas, the distance from one residential blob to the next is completely unwalkable. It's like the ecosystem of pandas. You know, you can't survive if there's small patches of residential areas. They have to be contiguous. This is, as I mentioned, predominantly the case in Beijing because of the highways. This diagram shows if you would take the 6 ring roads, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so actually they're 5.5. If you take those ring roads and amass all the surface they use and stick it right on the center of the map, that's much larger than the whole historic center. It's actually much larger even than the second ring. So this introduces sort of the notion of a whole new notion of sprawl, where in the West, sprawl has become sort of a catch-all for anything negative about urbanization. In reality, it started off as a purely neutral spatial term. What we did was, let's try and stick a little postfix on this term, use sprawl as a postfix and determine what's really going wrong with the sprawl. For instance, infrasprawl. The proliferation of infrastructure that uses more space that it can serve, and as such, it forces the city to expand faster than necessary. It's very much, for architects, I think that's a great metaphor, it's very much like building a skyscraper and trying to stick in escalators, elevators. At a certain point, you want to go higher, but it makes no sense. You need to do all kinds of difficult things, stack them up, because every time you add a floor at the top, you lose space at the bottom for elevators. There's a balance that at a certain point stops. The same, I argue, is the case for the city. You can't simply keep adding roads on. We did a model here, it's just a rendering, but we did a sort of a giant model that Peter mentioned it in Shenzhen. At that point also wasn't finished yet, half finished, of the ring roads. And we wrapped them around the Forbidden City at exactly the same scale. And the purpose is that it immediately gives planners and designers a sense, oh my God, Beijing is suffocating itself under these ring roads. So inadvertently, what was a beautiful monocentric model, one of the best examples in the world, is moving drastically to what they call polycentric model, but it's not proactive. There's no way that they're actually achieving these satellites. It's post-planning. It's producing a model on top of a reality that they're finding today. This is a drawing we made by tracing the real existing neighborhoods and settlements around Beijing. It's an entirely different map that you will find anywhere else. Generally, the maps stop right around here, urban core. The reason is that the people who are living in these zones are completely immobile. They're part of industry, and as such not really considered residents. They live temporarily in the factories on site, then after 2-3 years move back again. But as China hopes to make its way to what they call harmonious society, make its way to a market-driven society, it's all about mobility. The labor force needs to be able to move freely from all the way out there to anywhere where the jobs are. So at that point, their stunningly ambitious infrastructural system that they aim to achieve by 2030, 2050, the world's largest track-based infrastructure, even that ambition won't suffice on the map that exists today. These are at the same scale. So you can't, we can't outrun the reality that we find already today. Here is our density map in 2005, and that's proposed. What we're suggesting is that actually forces a sort of what they call pancake model, flat, broad expansion even further. There's a tradition of using the pancake, and we've we kept on using this sort of dough-related models because it's kind of funny. And the pancake is so popular, every cab driver will talk about the pancake model in Beijing. That's the cause of our problems. It's just spreading, it's low, and it's going out. In reality, what they're trying, the cookie model, is not much different. If you bake cookies in the oven and you place them too close to each other, if you're successful, and they're actually rising and growing, they'll glue together into a big giant blob. If you're unsuccessful, which is much more realistic in these top-down planned satellites, then you might as well not start in the first place. So everything is expanding, and the polycentric model that exists is augmenting this fragmentation. To the point that some people might know this mega city only an hour away from Beijing, Tianjin. Between now and 2030, this whole region is continuously urbanized. Before I try and produce some sort of ideal model for Beijing, at the same time, when finding these, doing these observations, we found a lot of phenomena that are extremely positive and forced us to reassess such things as sprawl and such things as, in this case, urbanization, and we termed this thing called trans-sprawl. If you're building a suburb of 500,000 people at once, Western planners come in and they're completely horrified, as I was when I first saw the thing in half finished in concrete. But then 3 years down the road, and visiting every now and then and seeing how this concrete environment is able to transform itself into a real city, it really introduced the notion that under the pressure of migration, with people moving in, places like this can actually thrive. So sometimes what seems monosprawl becomes something quite healthy, becomes healthy urban expansion. These are the two models we then introduced. We don't need to add another Beijing in satellites. Instead, we can grow within the footprint of infrastructure, of public infrastructure. So using the existing footprint and bringing that to roughly fourth level density, that's like a healthy metropolitan density, we can accommodate everything that needs to be, or needs to be homed by 2020. If you can do it in Beijing, you can do it nationwide. That means, for those who can read Chinese, this roughly translates into no new cities. That means the 400 cities that were planned to be built by 2020, we don't need them, and in fact, we don't want them. It's completely undesired. Every time you install another settlement, another cookie, it's going to produce mud like market-driven urban development. So what we can do instead is focus on this green edge, as we call it, sort of the footprint of mass transportation, and simply expand the rim, now lacking quality, and giving it quality with the influx of migrants. That still has a strong hint of being able to control and design, where unfortunately that's almost impossible. I feel that the last remaining truly utopian tool planners have to streamline the city is pedestrian-oriented transportation. And in the case for Beijing, what this study was about, you need something really drastic. So we designed a new form of infrastructure, basically a hybrid between a high-speed train and a people mover, a flat escalator. That's the most local form of transportation, which has a massive capacity. You can move a lot of people and you can get off just about anywhere. If you are able to somehow merge that with the high-speed train, you can really make environments pedestrian again. So what we did We put 2 full loops on the 3rd and 4th ring of Beijing. That land is extremely expensive yet not utilized. You put the rings on top, you connect the beginning and the end, and these what we call D-rails become operational and start serving your new center for Beijing. This shows sort of the feeling of a park on top, right on top of the D-rail. And it sits on legs over the 4th ring. And then bridges connect to our new pericenter, our new ring in Beijing. This is not an entirely new model. Ironically, it exists in China, or at least in Hong Kong. If you look at the elevated people mover in Hong Kong and the pedestrian environment it created all the way from the harbor up almost to the peak, it's extremely lively, it's extremely successful, and it has in effect elevated the city away from the roads up to its own level. We are suggesting that this sort of open environment could be produced even in Beijing if you are able to suck in enough daily commuters and then provide access to the surrounding buildings. So this is roughly what this kind of looks like. You enter it on the escalator, you accelerate, going up one arrow, you get to this secondary belt there, which means you're actually never stopping, you're never waiting for a train, you're always moving. Already when you exit buses, we developed this sort of flex bus system, bring you in from the far, far outskirts. They stop, they have to stop, or we're stuck with what I like to call sort of the London phenomena, where it's all public transportation, yet you're perpetually stuck in traffic. If you look around, everything is red. It's all buses stuck in traffic, so you can't undo the problem by taking out the private car. It will not suffice. All these regional buses coming together is still going to clutter the city and clog it. So what we do with the D-rail, we bring people in and then allow them to have an almost instantaneous shift to local transportation. You're on the secondary belt, you're already moving, and the train that never stops, so slows down, the doors open, you get inside, doors close again, you accelerate. Or you take your dog out to take your dog walking on the park. This was a bit of an ironic joke, because right on top of the fourth ring road, they planned the first green belt of Beijing. The second they planned it, it was already completely urbanized. So true post-planning. We're suggesting you can have your cake and eat it. Some projects that suggest how we take these rather utopian ideas and make them a little bit more applicable to people in the field. This is an installation we did in Rotterdam. It's an interactive installation. 2 glass panels allow you to click on the density map and actually design your own Beijing. And what it does, it calculates in the corner, it gives you a reading of how efficient your city is based on accessibility, based on the time traveled. It's a very interesting model because it reveals that density itself is not a dream tool. If you have scattered clusters of extreme density, it still doesn't do anything for you. You need to either really concentrate it in the center or have decent centers that can be served with transportation. So this notion, and that's where fear comes in, this notion to block migrants from the cities, to block real densities from occurring, it's based on fear in the sense that at the extreme populations in China, you have to sort of crowd manage and be hesitant to allow any uprise to occur. So planners in China are very keen to immediately diffuse and decentralize everything, and this model shows that that's simply counterproductive. So we zoom in further, I think I better speed up. We zoom in further and start developing typologies, building typologies that support the urban model. I don't know why it is, but still there's such a schism between urban planning and architecture where they're completely intertwined. If you build a certain grid, you can't make certain typologies. Certain typologies generate a certain environment, which generate a certain transportation and use of power, etc. The great thing about China, people love the big building. It's safe, it's somehow glorious, it's beautiful, it's modern. That means we can actually introduce sort of architects' dreams about big buildings without offending the new users. For this site, close to the center of Beijing, we produced a building that is very much an American test. We suggested, can we take the luxury of having a nice two-story villa in LA? We take the average LA density and we take the average floor space people have here with the front and backyard, maybe even a double car park. We give that to the new Beijing resident. Only we're going to stack it at 10 times Manhattan density. Not New York density, 10 times Manhattan density. In order, this was a calculation, in order to prevent Beijing even from having to expand. On this site that delivers a rather massive building, maybe step back, something like that, 29 towers. The shape of these towers follow a rather interesting sort of evolution, where originally the Le Corbusian tower block was such an idealistic model, and it's now being mass-produced in China solely on pragmatic, market-driven reasons. And we took the Le Corbusian block and tried to pull it further, because if you're stacking people, continue to make these towers higher, you have the same problem as mentioned, the cores. They're going to be congested, you don't have enough elevators. In addition, what we tried to do is say, let's make a tower that can represent the different strata of China. All these environments are completely walled off. This is middle class, upper middle class, upper middle, etc. Can we make a no-walls building, no-walls architecture, but while granting the reality of the developer that we need to offer different commodities to different target groups? In this model, we suggest, well, okay, let's make massive towers, ones with the holes, sort of social housing. They wrap around like a traditional social housing slab, but round. That immediately opens up space for additional elevators to be put inside. Then middle class towers and these super luxurious villa skyscrapers. The nice thing then, and we stick those on sort of the most extensive podium block of services and retail, that actually any transportation becomes redundant because you can get anything right in your building. If you do that, what you get is that these different strata are interconnected within the same system. And that's possible. You can still offer people sort of extreme luxury, because then the towers are connected by bridges. In fact, let me see if I have a picture. In fact, the villas have their own private elevator. You don't share it with anybody. It is possible because these giant towers offer extra space for individual elevators, and then you take the bridge right to your villa. It might sound extreme here. It's also extreme in China, but at least the notion of being able to provide luxury, extreme luxury, which developers want and need, within a much more heterogeneous environment is really an important topic. Things get smaller, more realistic. This was our first real assignment, commercial assignment in China. trying to look for a model that is like a hybrid between the qualities of the Hutong, the small alleys in Beijing, for instance, and the skyscraper, somehow offering the same density, but with the private space, the courtyard, the garden and such of the Hutong. Lastly, the research suggested, well, if you want to really build for these people who are suddenly, instantly, a new generation of urbanites, previously rural, now urban, what you need to do is to ask them what they want. We did an online survey suggesting, what do you want your city to be in 2020? How do you envisage your city? What kind of qualities do you want your home to have? The survey reveals rather interesting things. Basically, they want everything. We want bigger cars, but less roads. We want more parks and bigger homes, but we don't want long travel time, etc., etc., etc. The beauty about the Chinese young consumer, sort of the fresh consumer mind, is that they still have a perfect ambition of being able to sample their dream into something new. It also means that the planners and designers have to find models to incorporate all these very often contradictory ideas. If it's simply the two actors, government and developer, this is going to be impossible. At the moment, the two other actors that should be part of the dialogue are excluded, the end user and the designer. There's this famous Harvard study suggesting Chinese architects are 500 times more efficient than their Western counterpart. It's probably true. They're also 500 times less involved in the actual design decision-making process. It's drafting. It's high-speed copy-pasting. In China, I'm more subtle because there is a lot of change going on. There are huge amount of positive moments I have each day where I see we're already moving beyond that. In a general sense, it's still the case though. So we're suggesting we can only have this hybrid and this contradictory environment realized if we produce a sort of a closed loop of information between these four actors. Lastly, if this doesn't work, the book ends with the magazine. If all these ideas and policies won't cut it, or there's no time for it, this is the main excuse in China of trying to do anything. We don't have time. There's no time to design. We have to move on. If all this doesn't work, we produced a magazine that looks back from the year 2020 to the current and describes what has been produced. It's a rather beautiful, actually at first glance, quite amazing environment. These slick cities have become even slicker, even more beautiful. Hong Kong times 10, extremely intricate, extremely fascinating if you want to live there. However, reading the magazine is revealed that actually the qualities are dubious. I'll give you a simple example. We describe a city that has slowly taken over the whole north of Beijing, of China, such as the megalopolis we found. This area has become so compact and dense, architecture is no longer adding buildings, it's sort of subtracting cores, like the core of an apple, in order to create new housing. And within these new residential environments, the mindset of people has also changed, and this is absolutely already the case I find in Hong Kong, where, for instance, this girl we interviewed lived in a tiny apartment, but she felt, and she was selling her apartment as being this network where she could move around freely between a huge amount of commodities and services. So she wasn't living in a tiny room, she was actually living in this virtual home. Let me fast forward a little bit. all these ideas in order to come to terms with what is more likely this reality. And then the final project was a giant ship. And in those days, I was rather fascinated by American politics as well. It wasn't going as well as it is hopefully today. And I really felt that in the Chinese political system, if the world is dominated by both the US and China at a certain stage, maybe in 2020, for those who don't want to be part of either one, the only option is to take refuge on a ship. So we designed this giant boat that is nuclear powered and can float infinitely. Not so ridiculous, because now, for instance, many internet servers are on these giant podiums in the sea. Something like that. I don't know how we're in time. At that point, I would start talking about our real projects, but I think we can skip through it. So, our biggest dream in wrapping up the book, we started really humbly in a villa slash gallery slash studio in the suburbs of Beijing. It's now under construction. And a number of urban plans. What is interesting is that we are still able to, by and large, hold on to our ideas. For instance, in this case, we really try to create a truly pedestrian environment. Tianjin wants to rebuild its center in the world's first green CBD. And what we suggested was, well, being green is really not about slapping on additional amounts of solar panels. It's really about the use. How does the environment work? Where are the people coming from? And how are they operating within this environment? The amazing thing for us was to find tricks, tools, or at least slogans to sell these ideas and to prove that being sustainable is really more about being marketable and being economical. So this plan evolved, and we got to do the exhibition hall for that same area where we did the same trick. We suggested, well, we can make a sustainable building and actually earn your money. This is a basic system is a slanted glass panel which we use to project the images of the new city onto the ceiling, which you then see reflected in a sort of semi-transparent mirror, which then seem to float in front of you right on top of the city under construction. So they can play with new plans, constantly changing, constantly evolving, and being added to, and see them right on their actual site. And we suggested, well, as the city is growing, let's not ship all that soil from the foundations 20 miles down or even further, but let's use it and stick it against the building. So this plate is the actual building, only now it's wrapped and covered in soil and artificial mountains from the foundations. From that, we moved on to another museum slash office tower, which revealed to us that being public in China is a rather new concept. There are no public buildings. True public buildings, such as even museums, are primarily or even solely built for officials to see the latest work. So you design a museum with a clear 23-minute walkthrough for Mr. So-and-so to do the visit and get the approval for that new city. So you're building a giant showcase for one project. This tower tries to sort of denied that reality and suggest, well, maybe we can combine and mix the offices and the museum and let these two functions flow smoothly into each other. It's looking up into the atrium of the tower, and this is the atrium of the museum. And then what you can do is use the height of the tower as sort of a chimney for natural ventilation. So the space underneath is connected. The museum and the tower are connected, and air actually is pulled down through the museum and then up back into the chimney, back out again. Remarkably, they were okay with this proposal. The sustainable aspects, they really couldn't care too much about, but as long as it doesn't cost extra, you can get away with it. And now these bubbles are offering exhibition space within that weird transition zone of office and atrium. From that point, we moved on, all in the same city for some reason, all in Tianjin. We moved on to doing proposals for the TV tower right there. The weird thing about the TV tower is that there is no function, there's no program. Its main purpose is to be very, very tall. Being tall is a purely structural problem. We wanted to try and beef it up from, if you look at TV towers around the world, they're all completely identical. They have a rough sort of conish shape, and then a chunk, maybe a rotating deck or restaurant at 2/3 or at the top, and that's it. That's all the TV towers. We suggested we can, in this proposal, maybe produce a fake hollow tower that's suspended from a very simple structural core, and then put vegetation all around on the facades. And then now and then you have a viewing pad that sort of sticks through and it makes it look like sort of a comic or a weird fake building. That one didn't really fly. So we had to do another one. We said, well, let's keep thinking along this line. More structural. You can only go up. That's the only thing you can do. You go up and offer a program at 2/3. That's the structural solution. And after it's a bit distorted, but after a lot of soul searching, we found this is really the most efficient solution. However, we made a serious effort of explaining that obviously, structurally, it's not a knot. The thing is just a pin, it just goes up. It's brutally simple. But it suggests, that somehow the thing goes round and loops in and is a real knot and then goes back up again, and that must be really, really difficult to build. So no, it's just a little ring that's suspended on this stick, and that's it. The structure, the forces just go neatly up in there, and there's nothing to it. But that didn't fly either. Lastly, I don't know how we do these floating buildings. It doesn't sell very well. But lastly, we said, okay, in that case, there's only one option. We add program. If you can't make a regular TV tower work for you in that sense, we need to add program and try to maintain sort of the loftiness, airiness of the TV tower. So we put them in boxes. We didn't get any response on this one. Luckily, we're slowly moving forwards and trying to balance out what's possible in reality. This is a green proposal for the north of Beijing. There's one interesting thing I think I should mention about it. It's a cell pattern. That means that we try to find a solution of having to change the plan roughly every day, sometimes every other day. Add this, change that, not so much design, just the program. Oh, sorry, everything, we can't use the north corridor. Oh, no residential. Oh, next, well, actually, we should do. It's a very common practice. Developers are also feeling a lot of pressure from the government. This is one of the main problems in China, period. So it's very understandable. And we suggest, well, we need to find a design solution to deal with all these daily changes. So we developed a cell pattern that within the cell pattern, so this is one cube, including the outside space, you can change, add, and rotate these units without actually disrupting the corridors and the people flow. So the terraces always work and the connections always work. Another proposal was for a competition in Taiwan, maybe people know. I think the moral of the story is that ideas have to run from the top right down to the typology. It's all about typologies at the end of the day, and the weird thing about theaters is that it has a very long history of being extremely stubborn when it comes to the typologies. Auditorium, and then you wrap all the additional program offices and stuff, dressing rooms, you wrap that around this really quirky kind of box, which generally has, you know, things sticking out in all directions. I felt that these quirky boxes are so beautiful, we just leave them be. However, that's quite difficult, because where do you go? Where do you take the people who are coming in? Basically, two flows: the behind the scenes and the visitors. We suggested everything behind the scenes goes underground. So all the 4 theaters are connected underground, and there's this 4th tower, which is a public tower, and then you access the public areas through bridges from this sort of cross-like tower, which frees up the whole ground surface. Suddenly Taipei has this beautiful corner in the center of the city, has public space, where when you look at the program, you would expect that the whole site would be covered with some sort of a blob shape. This is a quick section. A similar train of thought. We're doing a lot of projects in the Shanghai Expo. Hopefully, two will actually be realized. This was a proposal for Tianjin Pavilion, where we suggested we've been doing all these interiors for the Shanghai Expo, and we're really absolutely horrified by the lack of content dealing with the topic "Better City, Better Life." Great topic, you know, just finished the book, and we were extremely excited. Nothing. All they wanted was, you know, sort of a Disney-like ride for people to feel how beautiful new Chinese cities will be, period. Well, they're not beautiful yet, and it's very unlikely they will be very beautiful very soon. But, you know, 90% of their audience in the expo will be rural migrants taking a day tour to Shanghai for the first time and seeing this, and it will look amazing. We suggested we have to try and hold on to some urban content and what's really happening. Can we make the whole building, the whole pavilion, into a giant diagram? So each hill is a city. The width of the hill represents the size of the city. So you can see right at the top. And the height, the speed of growth. And then it has markers, especially at night you can see how fast it's growing and how different cities relate to each other. Most of these cities are...
Of urbanism in North America, in the sense that we've expanded very rapidly and are now facing a kind of deflation. Do you consider that China may also experience a reversal? Have you modeled that?
Yeah, well, as far as we can. I mean, the numbers in China are very dubious, obviously. The beauty about China, for me as a designer there, for planners in general, I think, is that we don't have to worry too much about, for instance, shrinkage. That's a great, it's a very funny term. What we see in Detroit or in Russian cities, it's not going to happen very soon. Even if there are a lot of very mediocre building blocks being freed up, the influx of migrants looking for cheap residential areas is all but infinite. So important for us because when you have that certainty, that's when you can start modeling. If you don't have that certainty, it's almost impossible to make long-term planning.
Where do these migrants come from? Where's the immigration coming from? I thought they limit on the number of children you're allowed to have. To keep the population under control, why would they allow immigration?
Well, predominantly, the difficulty is, like I mentioned, it's multi-directional. So there's movement going from everywhere to everywhere. But the population growth in the cities, and even with the one-child policy in the cities, is still strong. In the countryside, the one-child policy sometimes enforced, sometimes less so. So population growth, natural growth, is still a very strong factor. Then people who are able to make it in the city. So maybe 60-70% is rollover or temporary migration to large cities and then move back to the villages. But another 30-40% are actually able to set up a life in the city, especially very young people, maybe 18, have nothing to do in the countryside. They can start doing some small business in the city rather successfully.
For those of us here who are looking to possibly do work in China, what would you recommend?
Don't.
That's why we came.
Well, let me be practical. In Beijing, for instance, foreign architects have been so successful, there was such a boom, and they're getting all the beautiful projects that locals were feeling a little bit frustrated. And now, 5 years later, yeah, there are a handful of really good Chinese architects as well. So there's less need to give these prestige projects to foreigners. And in reality, the cool projects are really very few. However, urban planning projects are all but infinite still today. And the horrible thing is, nobody knows really how to deal with these new urban plans. The Chinese have produced an immensely pragmatic model which allows them to produce cities at a tremendous rate. But they're coming now to terms with the fact that this pragmatism really doesn't produce much quality. Very slowly they're coming to grips with that. And then they're looking at foreigners and they're realizing foreigners, generally even some good planners, have serious trouble relating to the urban conditions and the political conditions in China. So it's very, very difficult for them. And that means that in general they refer back to their old practices. Like I mentioned, the number one excuse is always there is no time. There's no time to reconsider our approach, no time to design. So especially with urban planning, the economic pressure is huge, and more importantly the political pressure to produce your result in a rendering, in a slick image, and then bring that back to your superiors. It's dominating everything. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go. Obviously, you should go. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing, and we, the foundation, the research part of the company is still doing projects and throwing it out there and hoping that somehow it will stick and see what happens. And obviously, for us, teaching and lecturing is really effective because these young designers, they're getting a little bit, they're getting tough. We don't want to be just drafters, and here we see that there's different models, and they're just trying it. So through these ways, I think we're having an effect as well. There was a woman in the back. I think she should go first. She was waiting. Still have
Maybe it was me. I have, I guess, one question and one just concern that I contemplate quite a bit. You keep using the pronoun we as you've been speaking about your work, so I'd actually like to hear a little bit more about your firm or the collective you're part of, or who this we is. And then, to what degree have you been able to effectively work with the government bureaucracy in China and the outreach from central government in Shanghai or Beijing to more municipal governments quite a far distance from these larger central government entities? And then the second concern that I have is about the loss of cultural identity that stems from the transplant of rural people, especially this younger population that has this expectation and this dream that was reflected in the survey that you did with them about what they imagine their life to be in 2020, when in fact they have no experience whatsoever in a Western industrialized modern context to even imagine what that could contain, which is why you're not getting very accurate projections about what that is going to be. And how do we, as actors in China, for those of us who are working there in one capacity or another, not just transplant, our models of a modern city or an urban environment to a place that really has traditional expectations and a traditional cultural identity that doesn't really fit exactly into our model, and actually could contribute a lot to creating their own new model and not just adopting our solutions, which haven't always necessarily been successful.
Well, let me start at the end. I think the beauty about China is that it proves the Western models are flawed and are actually failing. Going back to the second question, in fact, I would say the problem in the West is very often that we've grown so accustomed to our lifestyle and our urban environment that we really don't question it. The amazing thing about the new generation we organize in China is that they are mentally a blank slate, and they have this really pretty progressive schedule on what they hope to achieve over the next few years. So if you combine these two, China proves that our environments are, one, auto-driven, etc., pedestrian, more importantly, are static. The success, I think 9 out of 10 of the world's favorite cities for people to live in are mid-sized European cities. Those are slow cities. They have evolved slowly. They're a patchwork, constantly attuning themselves to the latest desires of their residents. That luxury doesn't exist in China. It's instant. So the model from the West is completely inapplicable. What then, that for us opens a door to also show that the Chinese model doesn't suffice. Because in reality, there's a big sort of a tendency to be really nostalgic and talk about Chinese traditional culture, when in fact, the new environments are completely un-Chinese. If anything, they look more like old Western cities, I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but very often they have the Thames town that looks like a British village, and with everything, the detailing, they have, it's all repackaged in a sort of neo-Gothic, neo-Renaissance kind of plastic architecture. As I mentioned, the urban system completely unchanged. So the Chinese aren't reinventing themselves. The West can't copy the model. We can only really start from scratch, which is what we tried to do, at least to instigate this process and instigate the dialogue. Does that cover? Oh yeah, the first one. So there's two parts. We started off, I basically read this article and took my little office in Amsterdam, and it took me a few weeks to gather initial people, and I was very keen on getting non-designers and non-planners in. So we had a civil engineer who looked at the energy consumption and such, and we had social scientists who really traced and mapped these migrant paths and what it means for the people there, etc., etc. Got a very broad team in total. I think over 50 people contributed to the book in some capacity. And I took that team, started getting funding, which in Holland is slow, but very often quite successful. I gathered funding and shipped my whole office to Beijing to do the book. And I figured I could do that in 3 years. It took like 4.5. And the last 1.5 years, because the money ran out after 3 years, the last 1.5 years we were forced to do smaller commercial work, and we did a lot of urban plans, which also sort of brought in the reality, the really pragmatic and political reality of China into our thinking and into the book. And then when things really were done and the book was published, all but 3 people moved back to wherever they're coming from. Obviously, the Chinese people are still there, but also back doing their own thing. And then the last few projects, like the villa and the Tianjin projects, we did with our tiny little team, and collaborating quite closely with Chinese rendering farm, if you will. Crystal CG is a 2,000 people factory that produces these digital images. And they connected us to high-level government, to Qingdao government and Tianjin government and other places. So through them, we started to able to achieve things at a higher level. In reality, personally, I was just completely unable to do so many concessions that they would really accept urban plans. And their main concern was that the developer and the contractors wouldn't be able to understand what we're trying to do, and therefore wouldn't be able to produce these environments quick enough. So speed was absolutely, and we were designing at a ridiculous speed. So that wasn't really a problem, but the production speed was a major concern for them. So most of all the big projects so far are either on hold or are dropped, and now we're sort of building bottom up from the smaller Shanghai project, taking it from there.
That leads me to ask, your design process, in your design process, how seriously do you integrate the means and methods that are already existing? Because obviously that affects the speed and the production rate.
It depends. It differs per client. Some clients are much more willing to try new things, of course.
I wasn't really talking about willingness. I was actually talking about ability to incorporate radical ideas rapidly into the production stream.
Let me describe a little bit how the process generally goes. And I'm not kidding, unfortunately. If we have a good meeting, there's a decent level meeting. When we come in, the first response is great. For an architect, oh, Dutch, okay. Housing, great. Let's roll. This is good. Then we sit down, and then there are 3 conceptual slides that, for instance, suggest what our main ideas and how we're trying to, for instance, approach sustainability. We're stopped immediately. Can you fast forward to the last slide? Literally. So the first time I heard that was like, okay, well, what about the idea? No, just please fast forward. We just want to see what it looks like. So you fast forward to the last slide, and then, oh, okay, then we have another sort of aha moment. okay, I think we can work with that. And then we can backtrack and explain how we got to that point and instill some of the ideas and concepts. And then the next phase, as we're closing in on a real detailed proposal, generally that's when things get pretty sticky, because they see, for instance, with the one that got very, very close was the project in north of Beijing with the cell pattern, because we were able to respond to all their demands. We were seemingly so flexible, and even more flexible than the Chinese design. We were just, yeah, whatever, bring it on, we'll do it. And that was the attitude, the only attitude that allows you to survive. And it got very, very close, but then there the contractor, they looked at the sections and he was getting nervous about, how it looks rather simple and smooth, but it's complicated and not something he thought he could build in 3 months, and obviously I don't want him to build it in 3 months either. So at that point we got much more rigid, and then things fall apart. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Hi. Hey Karen, yeah.
Okay, so last question.
Last question.
Neville, I think, since being in Beijing, I know that there's some sort of internal or non-descript competition that might be going on from architectural schools in China. Do you have any idea of whether the government is seeking more designs from local architects rather than searching for foreign architects? Or could you talk about that?
Officially, yeah, there is an official policy now in place that basically blocks foreign entrance to large-scale building. It's very, very difficult. At the same time, I think for urban planning there's still a lot of room. They're now coming to terms, and maybe this is the time for us to get with it. They're coming to terms with the idea that anybody who can give some answers should stand up and try. Because it's not going anywhere, and these new environments are for now, after the first ones are finished for 5, 6, 7 years, they're really proving their ineffectiveness, and also they're not being sold, for instance. The schools, every major design school wants to be in China, and I think the role of the government is very simple. If you bring your own money, you can do whatever you want. It's a great example of how fast the society itself is changing, where we're complaining about the quality of designers and such. I'm complaining about Chinese students entering abroad, etc. 3 years ago it was very difficult. Now thousands and thousands and thousands of students are being sent abroad for a year, and they come back and they have a completely altered vision. They actually feel sort of a sense of autonomy, that they are able to contribute to the discussion, that their design is desired, that it's not a matter of some top-down hierarchical decision-making process. This is going to be a real change, of course, if out of nowhere all these new, rather inspired young designers are taking charge, then things will start happening. That's a really positive ending there, wow.
Absolutely. And I think for the school, it's an interesting point, because I think now more than ever, even in our cities, the architects have to take a stance and perhaps become involved again. And as you noted, with this administration, perhaps that might be possible. So,
yeah,
thank you, Neville.
Thank you.